sounds like a stupid question.
Probably is, because, yeah, go ahead. Skilled managers equals high morale, which equals all that cool stuff that you cannot pay for and you can't punish for. When you close off that feedback channel, you are not going to be able to hear the truth. In the first microseconds, your brain can't tell the difference between physical danger and what we call social danger.
I'm pissed off at you.
Me, specifically?
Well, just because you're my boss and all.
Employees tend to get promoted until they reach their level of incompetence. Go forward and don't suck. Welcome, everyone, to the Managing with Mind and Heart podcast. I am one of your hosts, Michael Nash, and with me is
Ethan Nash. It is good to be with you again, folks.
Yeah, it's good to be back. Yeah, I'm glad to be here today, and let's just jump right in. We've got a really, I think, intriguing and important topic today.
We're talking about, as you might have gleaned from the episode description and episode title, we're talking about fairness at work. And so, Mike, let me ask you, just generally speaking, I mean, why is it so important that managers avoid any sense of unfairness, whether real or perceived? And like, why is this one of our top 15 management skills?
It's a deep question, and it's really important. This issue of fairness, it is, I mean, as a manager, and I'll just say this, even as a parent, right? We've heard so many times just angst about that's not fair, right? That's unfair. It is such a deep human concern and need, I guess, for us to be treated fairly. And I think we could bring this back to, Ethan, we talked about the SCARF model, right? Back in, I think it was episode 27, and it was repeated again just a little while ago. Let's really briefly just remind our viewers about SCARF, the idea that there's these 5 domains that through our evolutionary history as human beings, we've come to really be sensitive to these 5 things because it's all a matter of survival, right? So let's go through those really quick. The S was status, my sense of feeling good about who I am and my sense of status in the world.
And C of SCARF is certainty. You know, the sense of feeling like I know what can be expected in my environment and in my life and what's going on around me.
Right. And the A is autonomy, the ability to have some control over my environment.
And R is relatedness to, as it implies, you know, the need to relate to other people, to be a part of other people, a group, to be accepted.
And the F, what we're talking about today, is about fairness. And the idea here is these needs developed in us as we evolved for the very reason that if these needs were not met back in our ancient tribes of, 50 people or whatever, we could die, right? What would happen to one of our prehistoric tribe ancestors who was treated unfairly, right? They possibly wouldn't have the same amount of food. They wouldn't have mating opportunities. At the very worst, right? They get expelled, left out to die somewhere, right? So as human beings, we developed a really instinctual and deep need to have these 5 domains taken care of. And so bringing this back to your question, fairness, we humans are really, really sensitive to this. And as soon as you sense that you're being treated unfairly, whether it's true or not, whether it's actual favoritism or whether you're just imagining it or making it up in your head, it doesn't matter. You're going to have this trigger go on where your fight, flight, or freeze instincts kick in. And it's just a big deal. It matters a whole lot.
That's well said there. I think it's important just to know that your employees, especially when you have a power differential over your employees, which you do, they are going to be on high alert to unfair behaviors by you, which also, leads me to ask, I mean, I've experienced situations with different leaders or managers where they don't really want to talk about fairness. They kind of think it's a little bit, childish or something like that. I mean, what have you experienced that before? And what's your I guess, thoughts on getting managers to really understand why they need to talk about this skill and work on it?
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, I'm really glad you brought up. I'm going to back up track a tiny bit. The fact that you brought up fear is so important because that's literally what we're talking about. And yes, unfortunately, I've worked with plenty of managers who, when they hear employees, I'll use their term, whining about this is unfair, or you're not being fair, or I'm not being treated fairly. I've worked with many managers who have perceived that as childish and immature and almost had some disdain for that sort of behavior. And I have to remind them, well, actually, back to your original question, that's why this is one of the top 15 management skills, is because it really, really matters. And we can't minimize this when we hear about it. When people feel they're being treated unfair, again, whether that's actual or perceived, they are going to experience fear, whether they tell you they're afraid or not, or whether they're even aware that they're afraid. On a deep evolutionary level, they're feeling fear. And when employees feel fear, as we've said many times here, they absolutely can't bring their best self to work, right? Their sympathetic nervous system kicks in and they're defending themselves and they're shut down. And so it just matters so much as managers that we manage for fairness. And that's why we're talking about this here today.
Good. So let's take a step back for a moment and just define some terms. I mean, to some people this might seem like kind of duh type of stuff, but it's I think it's important to kind of ground ourselves in what we're talking about here. So just real quick, what is favoritism? What are we talking about when we're talking about favoritism?
Well, I think a lot of ways we could answer that, but what we say in our workshop, to be real succinct about it, is as favoritism is the practice of treating people more favorably due to either conscious or unconscious bias, right? So let me just say that in a different way. Favoritism is I'm going to treat this person in some way better than I'm going to treat this other person, whether consciously I'm aware of it or I'm not even aware I'm doing it. And then, yeah, so let's dig into that. I mean, I mentioned bias there, conscious, unconscious bias. Again, maybe this is obvious stuff to our listeners, but Ethan, how do you define a bias, right? What is a bias, or what is an unconscious bias, and what's the difference between the two of those?
Well, how would I define bias? The kind of dictionary definition of bias is a preference or an inclination, especially one that inhibits impartial judgment. Now, taking that, and we're talking about now an unconscious bias, that refers to prejudiced or unsupported judgment in favor of or against one thing, person, or group as compared to another. And all of that, of course, as it implies, is happening unconsciously. So, I mean, that's your kind of basic definition of biases and unconscious biases.
Okay, so basically, I'm internally feeling more favorable towards somebody or something than something else. It's just a bias, whether I'm aware of it or not.
Exactly.
How do we develop those? Like, where do our biases come from?
As I've heard it been said before, if you have a brain, you have bias, right? So, I mean, the kind of mechanism of biases, from what we understand through the science, is just biases simplify the world for us by basically creating mental shortcuts. So they're giving us, quick information about what is good or bad or safe or unsafe or trustworthy or untrustworthy or friend or enemy, right? So it's these quick, thin slice information that we get, and it's often inaccurate, right? And so it actually is a pretty, again, in evolutionary terms, it's a pretty useful mechanism, right? Because it has saved us cognitive energy when we can kind of group things together and basically be able to make a judgment on things without having to put in a lot of thought into it. That again has saved us some energy, so we can focus more on surviving and picking berries and things like that.
Right.
So and it's also important to know to just in general, our biases are going to tend to be skewed towards the negative. And the way I like to explain this is we as human beings can make two types of errors, speaking generally, right? We can make what they call a type 1 error and a type 2 error. And so, for example, a type 1 error. So imagine your ancestors long, long ago were walking through the forest and the grass starts to move. And you think that is probably a snake, right? And so you act accordingly. But as it turns out, it wasn't a snake. It was just the wind, right? Moving the grass. Well, guess what? That's a low cost error. You thought it was a snake.
The fact that you jumped away and kind of ran down the road a little bit doesn't cost anything.
Now, the other type of error is type 2 error, which is, again, same situation. The grass moves. You think it's probably just the wind. And so then you keep walking and it turns out it's a snake and it bites you. And congratulations, you've earned the Darwin Award, which is essentially getting removed from the gene pool. So making that error was a lot more costly to our species. So therefore, we're going to tend to assume the negative about situations, right? Because again, that's how we survived. If we assume the negative and we were wrong, it has minimal cost to our survival. And so because of that, we're primed with this negativity bias, right? So we learn to make these quick judgments and lean towards the negative. And so again, we're more likely to assume that a situation or a person is negative because it has less cost if we're wrong. So again, coming back to fear, many biases we have are often fear-based, whether we know it or not. And so fear kept us safe. It's part of survival. So again, some biases are conscious, some are unconscious. And I really do believe the first step with kind of examining your own biases and talking about your own biases is a little bit of self-compassion, right? Recognizing that our biases are part of being human. We got wired with them. And so to start with a little kind of self-forgiveness so you can work out a plan to, avoid making some of these errors in judgment. Does that make sense?
It does. It's really good. And I like the self-compassion piece because we absolutely all have biases. We absolutely do. And pretending we don't or beating ourselves up for having them doesn't make any sense. In fact, the path toward growth and really excelling in this area is to become actually aware of those biases, right? Over time. So yeah, we all have them. I think in general, I want to give us a little exception here in a minute. In general, if we don't examine our biases and if they stay unchecked, they're going to reinforce these stereotypes and beliefs that are often wrong, right? And they're going to lead to us misjudging. They're going to lead to us actually doing harm because the biases will influence the way we act and the way we behave and the way we treat people. So it's really important that we become aware of them. Just a side note, Ethan, I want to be clear that we're not implying that our biases are always negative or always wrong. I mean, I might have an employee who just does amazing work in this certain type of task, and I want to ask them to do it again, right? I'm biased toward this employee in this one particular way. There's nothing wrong with that. So let's be careful that we don't paint with too broad of strokes. But bottom line, we just have to be aware of our biases as much as possible so that they don't do harm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, agreed. Biases might be positive, they might be negative, but we do have a negativity bias. But all that said, again, it's important that we manage for fairness. So what are the various types of fairness related concerns that you have seen, show up in workplaces? Like, what are kind of those main ones that you would tend to witness if you were a fly on the wall in a workplace?
Yeah, let's maybe parlay this back and forth a bit, but I've seen and been involved with working through a lot of these. So, there's fairness around promotions, opportunities, who gets certain kinds of tasks, those kinds of things, right? That can be a real pretty common concern. And again, these might be based on actual favoritism. It might be based on positive or negative bias, and it might not be. It might just be something that the employee is perceiving. But yeah, opportunities, those kinds of things would be one that comes up a lot.
Yeah, I mean, there's also just fairness in terms of who people are spending time with. Time is a commodity. So that's one that I know can come up, that we're not always aware that we might spend more time than others with other people. And then there's also just biases. And I think this often goes to the unconscious, like biases towards things we might not even think about. Taller people, right? We might think more think of them as more competent or powerful. And there's actually some, research on that. So there's those little ones that kind of sneak in as well.
Well, let's do some more of those. I think it's going to be worth spending a few minutes on what might be some of these unconscious biases. And the one you just mentioned was height. Let's add just physical attractiveness, and why the fact that we might be biased toward people. And I recently actually saw a study that said the same thing. Tall people, attractive people, right? They get more opportunities in lots of different areas of life.
Gotcha. That explains a lot about my failed career.
I was just about to make that joke about myself, but you beat me. How about the obvious, not obvious, but the ones that come up a lot, of course, is gender bias, gender bias, age bias, and the age bias, man, that can work in both directions. You can be biased against for being quote too old. You can be biased against for being too young.
Yeah, I mean, so we're talking about age, gender. Let's put out race, color of your skin. Right, that there is biases that we might not be aware of, and we're rewarding people based on those characteristics.
How about dialect? I'm actually reading a novel right now, and one of the points that's made is that these folks from the South, because of the way they because their accent, basically, the way they get treated, and people assume they're not intelligent, right, based on dialect.
Yeah, dialect, and also even just like the way you dress.
Yep. I heard a person on the news the other night say something complimenting America by saying, even a trash collector can succeed in this country and rise up to blah, blah, blah. And I just thought, what about profession? The way we judge people based on what they do for a living.
Yeah, absolutely. Politics could come into this, if you're aware of people's politics. What else?
Well, maybe other areas at work where people get concerned about fairness. I mean, some of it gets. I'm tempted here to almost sound like some of those managers that kind of downplay and minimize this, but I recently had a person complain that their name was always last in the to line of the group email, and I'm bringing that up not to say that we have to be concerned about those kinds of things as managers, but to maybe just continue to make the point that people are really highly sensitive to this issue.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, to reiterate some of the key points here, just so we're hearing them throughout this, it's, whether the favoritism or biases are real or perceived, it doesn't really matter. Right, from a manager's perspective. What matters is that you're managing for the perception of fairness or unfairness. I think that's an important point to hold on throughout this. I think we can get caught up on, well, I wasn't actually being unfair there. And you may be right, right? You may be right, but that is really not the point, right? Especially, as I said earlier, when you have this power differential over your employees. Right, that the chance of the perception of unfairness is going to be a lot more likely with that power differential.
And what you just said is really important, that managers continue to focus on that. It's about perception. We don't have to beat ourselves up or dig so deep that we're always telling yourself, oh my gosh, I'm being unfair. Oh my gosh, I'm being unfair. It really is about managing perception, because, you can do the most basic. I mean, here's another area, right? I can give recognition and praise to somebody and have somebody else now feel like I'm being unfair, right? Because they didn't receive comparable recognition or praise. I could ask people's opinion on a decision and not ask some other people's opinion, and that can be perceived as being unfair, right? I mean, we could step in this trap of unfairness, or the perception of unfairness, really easily. And we do. Managers do all the time, which just brings us right back to the point. We have to be thinking about this consciously and managing for it.
Absolutely. And kind of part of the reason you want to manage for it is, I think it's just the right thing to do, to have a fair and equitable workplace. But I mean, there's an organizational motivation researcher who's done a lot of this type of work around, again, motivation. His name is Richard Clark, and he's kind of outlined, I think, 5 or 7 of the biggest motivation killers. And one of the very top ones is a perceived sense of unfairness.
Yes.
Right? It's the quickest way to unmotivate a workforce is by that perception of unfairness, right? Because that's what harms morale, which is going to harm engagement. So even just from the performance of your team, this matters. And it's the right thing to do when you're leading other people.
Yes.
Well, let's maybe dig in a little bit deeper to these biases and talk about maybe some specific ones. So what are some of the more subtle biases that can get in an organization's way in trying to create that fair and equitable workplace that we're aiming for?
Yeah, I mean, we've listed a lot of them, and there's a couple that have kind of come up actually more recently as a lot of our clients have moved to hybrid or remote work. One of them we call the proximity bias, and it's this idea that we, as managers, we tend to favor people who are closer, physically closer to us, right? People who we can walk down the hall and talk to, as opposed to have to dial up, right? Or someone who happens to be in the cubicle next to mine, or, you know, in the building I'm working in, as opposed to working in a different building, in a lot of different ways. And it makes sense, right? When you think about this, I'm going to be more likely to, you know, for example, when I'm wanting to make a decision and I want to get some, you know, I want to consult with somebody. Well, it's a lot easier just to consult with these people that are sitting right here. And then I might not even think about asking the people that I have to dial up, right? And so now we have this example of the proximity bias where I've just kind of done the most expedient, the easiest thing, but the people who did not get asked and who don't feel included, right? Their scarf need for relatedness and fairness and even some autonomy, right, might be triggered because I left them out. Think about that a little bit with me. What other privileges might I not be distributing equally, right? If, you know, to people that are maybe farther away from me in physical distance.
Yeah. Something that we might have mentioned before, but you know, you said it earlier. How about just kind of staffing or assigning people to important projects, right? Am I going to be more likely to either walk out my office door and take a look around to see who I might want to put on this project? That could be an issue.
Yep.
Right. We're not even thinking about the people that might not be in the room with us. Right. Our brains just don't tend to go there. So staffing an important project.
Yep.
Or again, another thing that you said earlier of just kind of seeking opinions on decisions. Right. Yep. Maybe I need kind of a quick data point, or I have an idea I want to bounce off somebody. Well, I'm going to go to the people that are closest to me if I'm not managing for this bias.
Yeah. And we've all, I mean, most of us have seen or experienced proximity bias in action if you're involved in hybrid meetings. You know, if I'm facilitating a meeting and I've got a bunch of people sitting here with me in the room and I've got 3 or 4 people that are on the screen, it's really, really difficult to be, I'll use the word fair, right? In terms of things like airtime and who gets to sound in on things. And, you know, it's a real specific, special skill to be able to lead a hybrid meeting effectively. And that's because of literally this thing called the proximity bias.
Absolutely. What else? What else comes to mind here of how the proximity bias might show up in terms of privileges that you're giving to people and not others?
Subtle things might be, again, I compliment people, praise them for good work because they happen to be near me. They happen to walk by me. I happen to see them at the, you know, stereotypical old water cooler kind of thing. So they get more of that, you know, they get more of the recognition and praise because it's just extra, you know, there's extra barriers and steps for me to actually reach out to someone who's farther away. So I might not do it. Even just relatedness, relationship building and who I'm spending time with, right? And they can actually get more systemic. I mean, there's one study that showed that you much less likely to actually get promoted if you're working remotely as opposed to working in person at the office, right? So this can extend to things even as important as that.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I mean, and cognitively, it like totally makes sense. Like I can understand that how that would happen. Like just taking the promotion piece, right? Like you said, if I am running into somebody, you know, at lunch or, you know, in the break room or just on the way to work in the hallway or whatever, you have that many more opportunities to know that person, get comfortable with that person, understand that person if you're not careful. And so without even thinking about it, when I'm thinking about promotions, well, I'm going to think about the person that I've built the relationship with that I know is competent.
Yep.
With excluding all these other people that are just as competent or, in a good position to have this promotion, but we just haven't spent that much time with them. Right. And so I'm just kind of reflecting on this of, I could see how this could easily happen.
Well, let's do, there's another, we're talking about some of these more subtle biases that we might not be aware of, we might be aware of, but there's also this behavioral bias. And this is the idea that there's just certain types of behavior styles. And we've done several episodes here on that. There's certain types of behaviors that the way they show up tends to lead to them getting more rewards and recognition at work. Example might be, and again, this is pretty obvious, right? Somebody who speaks up more often, who jumps in and makes statements at meetings, right? Who chats with people, who socializes, right? That person is going to more likely than not be considered probably more often for things like promotion or special projects, etc. Can you think, Ethan, of other kinds of behaviors that might lead to being treated more favorably at work?
Yeah, one would just be someone that's more inclined to be assertive in the sense of, asking for what they want and what they need.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Some of us are more inclined to be able to kind of speak up about those things, and others might not. And so think about that. The people that are asking for what they want and need, are they going to be more likely to get what they want and need than those that are more shy about asking for that?
Absolutely.
I mean, absolutely. And I've seen that, quite often. I've seen it quite often.
And there's nothing, that that's not really a negative in the sense that I didn't do anything wrong as a manager by, meeting needs of people who ask to have their needs met, right? But the next step for me would be to obviously dig in and ask more questions and bring out more, bring things more out from those other folks.
Right. I think it's a recognition that everybody has wants and needs. And so if you're only hearing those wants and needs from a few people, well, that should be a sign, to make some adjustments there and consider who might not be sharing those things with you. I think also there could be a behavioral bias towards people that just make faster decisions. Like they're viewed as, quicker on their feet, right? That could even be translated into they're viewed as more competent. Like they might need less time for processing. That could show up as well.
Yeah, that you're getting to the difference between processors and expedients, and it's really, really obvious in the workplace that expedients are getting rewarded more often. I actually one time was helping an executive team hire a new member of their executive team, and these happened to be four men in this case, who were all expedient on the expedient process continuum. And they already knew that they needed to balance their team out better. They knew they needed to look for people who had different gifts and different strengths. But they interviewed this man who was, I believe, and later on they even said he was very well suited for the position. He didn't get the job. And when they dug back into one of the reasons he didn't get the job, the statement came up, well, he didn't think on his feet during the interview process. So they would ask him a question and he'd have to process, and that turned out to be a strike against him. Well, that is a really obvious example of basically choosing an expedient over a process person for no reason other than it just didn't feel right, right? That's an example of the behavioral bias in action.
Yeah, and it shows up in meetings as well, which relates to what you were saying earlier about just people that might use more airtime, right? And people that are quick to state their decision or opinion, right? If we're not careful in meetings, then those are going to be the people we always hear from, right? If we're not providing the time for the processors to process. And that is one of, I think, the bigger traps that I see people fall in when they're not aware of this stuff, right? They're not even thinking about that there are processors in the room that might have just as good or better ideas that just aren't getting that opportunity to share.
Right.
What about just strong networking skills? Right. And let me toss that one back at you. like how would that show up? Like how could somebody be rewarded consciously or unconsciously for those strong networking skills?
Well, it's that person who is constantly creating links with other people, having the assertiveness to push into someone else's world and ask the right questions and get to know them, find out what they're interested in, see where they have connections. I mean, it's just a really great social skill to have in general. It's going to serve you well in your life. But clearly, someone who is more prone to that kind of behavior is going to make more connections, which is going to lead to more popularity, which is going to lead to more opportunity and more visibility, et cetera, et cetera. Well, when we go through this list, and again, I don't want to make this like a test for you or even for our listeners, but we've talked about the 4 behavior styles, right? The analyzers and the conductors and the promoters and the listeners. Who are we talking about here, Ethan? Who do you think about when we make that, when we list those different behavioral qualities?
It's the promoters and or conductors,
Right.
right? It's those styles that are going to be often more expedient, more assertive, more likely to socialize and have a lot of, connection throughout the day. I mean, I really think that those are the people that we're talking about here.
Yeah, we absolutely are. And that means that the analyzers, the listeners are going to not have the same opportunities and they're not going to have a leg up. And I think that's something that we need to be aware of in hiring, in promotions, in opportunities. And when you say that, right, you mentioned the conductors and the promoters. I mean, speaking of unconscious bias, right, would it surprise you to know that white men actually get more rewarded for those behaviors that we just listed than do women or people of color?
That doesn't surprise me at all. That doesn't surprise me at all. Right. I think that I've witnessed and researched just kind of what happens there. But I mean, take women, for example, if they are more assertive,
Mm-hmm.
they tend to get more kind of negative adjectives tossed their way. Right. They're, I don't know, fill in the blank there with things you've heard.
Yeah, aggressive, right? Women that speak up, and actually black men who are more assertive, right, are aggressive,
Mm-hmm.
whereas white men are being assertive, pushy, etc., as opposed to direct, that kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I want to kind of move us into solutions and some actual kind of practical stuff that managers and teams can consider. Obviously we're talking about the different types of biases, how they show up, what to be aware of. But what might be some manager mindsets and behaviors that might make it less likely that employees will experience, actual or perceived favoritism or experience your biases, and what can an organization do overall to help mitigate some of this stuff?
Yeah, that's the question, right? We've outlined the issues, the landmines, the things we could step in accidentally, but man, what do we do about this? And we've spent a lot of time so far talking about like unconscious bias, and I just want to start with kind of the personal growth aspect of this, right? Just the willingness as a manager to practice self-awareness, to practice humility around discovering their own biases. I really like the way you mentioned at the beginning, Ethan, about self-compassion, because this work that I'm describing here really requires us to remember that we all have these biases, and that, if we start beating ourselves up and if we're not kind to ourselves when we notice them, we're much less likely to notice them, right? It's just a natural sort of self-protection mechanism, right? We just stay in denial because we don't feel good about ourselves. But if we can practice self-compassion, we can say, oh, okay, so I want to find out where I'm harboring these biases. I want to be curious. I want to ask others possibly if they're noticing behaviors that might indicate bias, right? I might do more reading about this topic. I might listen to podcasts, but whatever my method, I think the first thing is that we go on a journey of discovery, I guess I'd like to say.
In the spirit of personal growth, self-awareness, working on your blind spots. Let me maybe mention a few resources, I suppose, that have been useful for me when I'm looking at things like unconscious bias or conscious bias or stereotypes that I might be making that I'm not aware of. And again, like I said, and then like you said, and like I'm going to say again, as you dive into these resources, come with a lens of self-compassion for yourself, right? Because you may read things or hear things in which you kind of get a look in the mirror and say, that is something that I've been doing and I didn't know I was doing it. And it seems negative and that hurts. And I might have damaged relationships along the way. Well, look, that's the first step to growth, is being able to recognize that, have some self-compassion, and then work out a plan to move forward. And so as a general resource, I find the podcast called The Hidden Brain just great in general for understanding all sorts of kinds of biases. I mean, there's several episodes on biases in terms of, stereotypes that we might make, as well as all sorts of other cognitive biases, and just kind of getting a deep understanding of, these behaviors or thought patterns that come up that, we are not totally conscious of. So that's one. And then a book that I was given by a professor in undergraduate is called Whistling Vivaldi by Claude Steele. And it's basically about how stereotypes affect us and what we can do about them. So I'm not going to say a whole lot about that. It's a quick read. It really changed the way I look at kind of the world around me and people around me and what other people might be experiencing from me and others that I was totally blind to, based on their gender, their race, and so on and so forth. So there's a couple I would mention there. What about you? What are some things that you have found useful for your own kind of journey and exploration in this area, or resources that you've heard of that have been helpful for other people?
Yeah, I just happen to have been putting together a resource list recently for another project, and I did some Googling and found 3 books. I mean, let me just start with one of them I actually have read, and I was reminded about how good this book was. It's called The Leader's Guide to Unconscious Bias, and that's by Pamela Fuller. And actually, I absolutely recommend that one. There's these other 2, and I'll just be clear, I haven't read them, but I dug in, I read the excerpts, I read the reviews. There's actually certain things that I look for and kind of hope doesn't show up in some of these bias books. I have some of my own quote biases, and I was really happy with what I saw in these 2. One of them is called Blind Spot, and the other one is called The End of Bias, and it actually looks like it really digs into the science and the practice of overcoming unconscious bias. I think, again, the bottom line, though, is kind of do your own hunting and dig into what you think might be helpful for you. And just as a manager, the beginning of this process of not showing favoritism and treating everyone fairly is to, with a lot of self-compassion, dig into your own biases so that you're aware of them, so you can manage them as you go. Awesome. Well, we will link to those resources in the show notes for you all to check out. Again, just encourage you to lean into this, right? It can be kind of scary to start unpacking these things, about yourself and what's been going on in your unconscious that is kind of showed up in your behaviors. So lean into that. But, taking, kind of a bigger picture of an organization, right? So this is kind of more about what individuals can go about doing, but what can an organization do in general to kind of build it into the system in which people are managing for fairness and people are just generally behaving in a way that's leaning towards fairness and equity and things of those nature? Yeah, I think to start with, and this sounds really obvious, but be the kind of organization that doesn't just engage in the PETA principle and welcome to management, good luck, and we're not going to give you any skills. Like provide training and provide, make sure your managers are aware of the top 15 management skills and help them, work toward achieving those. And that includes helping managers understand the importance of doing that self-discovery work around their biases, what it looks like to be a manager that manages for fairness. So I'd start with just be the kind of organization that equips their managers. And then, to go deeper into this particular area, I think it's important that organizations do provide training around anti-bias work and helping managers especially, but everybody to understand the concepts behind inclusivity and equity. And I just think it's important that those efforts are extended to the managers and that they do it in a way that's really helpful. I know, Ethan, you and I have, we've looked at some research. We have some opinions about kind of what works and maybe what isn't quite as effective in terms of anti-bias work in organizations. Let me just say, we're not experts on this. We don't go into organizations and do training on diversity and inclusion. We believe it's important. We believe that the work that we do aligns with it really well. But let me ask you this, Ethan. If you were recommending to an organization that they engage in some kind of anti-bias training, what would be some of the things you'd ask them to consider and to kind of look for when they're making those decisions and making those choices?
Mm-hmm. I mean, the first thing that I would recommend, that I have recommended to organizations, is look for, again, an anti-bias or a DE&I program that is generally evidence-based, right? There's a whole spectrum of this type of consulting services or trainings out there. But, what we find from the research is a lot of these programs can actually do more harm than good. But the ones that do good and are effective are generally the ones in which they come in and do some sort of, needs assessment on the upfront. Like, what is actually going on in this organization so we can address the issues, right? As opposed to just kind of, guessing what might be going on in this organization. Mm-hmm. So starting with a needs assessment, research shows, is pretty critical in terms of making these programs actually have positive effects that are sustained. So that's the first thing. What about you?
Yeah, that's really good. I also, one that doesn't stop with just awareness. I think there's some of these programs, it's about uncovering the biases, and they can do really good work around that. They can push really hard on it, but they can, if they're not careful, they can leave people a little raw, and they can, because of that, cause people to get more defensive and almost hunker down even more into their quote camps. So instead, it's programs that really build in skill building and action steps and what are we going to do differently, just actions attached to the training. So it's more than just awareness.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And there's research that I think we've both read on that as well, what you're alluding to there. Anything else you want to say about how organizations might want to, find these types of services for them?
Not specifically about the type of or the organization that they choose, but I would say just make sure it is happening in conjunction with overall management training. So it's not just this carved out thing that's all by itself, that is this primary focus, but isn't in context of generally managing well. I think if you don't put those two things together, there can be a lot more resistance. There can be more cynicism. It doesn't quite land, and I don't think it's as sustainable if you don't connect it with a broader effort toward management development and management training.
You know what? We got more to discuss on this topic. Mike, Dad, why don't you tell them what we're going to cover next episode?
Yeah, I want to, as we start our next episode, continue this topic of fairness and start getting into more of it might be considered more conscious bias, and we'll define that as we go. But what are some other things that managers can do and not do to make it less likely that their people are going to feel like they're being treated unfairly? So we'll dig into some really practical stuff in the next episode.
All right. Well, I'm looking forward to it. So stay tuned in on that, folks. Hey, just a couple quick reminders before we turn the mics off. We have a newsletter, monthly newsletter, and really what we're putting out on that thing is articles that we're writing about leading others, managing others, including topics such as, creating fairness in the workplace, building morale and engagement, and a whole bunch of other topics. So get on that newsletter. You can do that by texting the word leading to 66866. Text the word leading to 66866. And besides that, folks, if you like this podcast and you want to support us, the best way you can do that is by leaving us a review. Leaving us a review helps other people like you find this podcast. Besides that, we will see you next time, everybody. Goodbye.